There is a detail in this verse that most people read past without noticing. Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. But think about the physical fact for a moment. How does anyone slap you on the right cheek? If you and your attacker are standing face to face, a right-handed person's natural blow lands on your left cheek. To strike your right cheek with a right hand, the attacker has to use the back of the hand. That is not a slap. That is a gesture of hierarchy. In the world where Jesus spoke, a backhanded blow was the way a master struck a slave, a Roman struck a Jew, a soldier struck a civilian. It was not meant to injure. It was meant to humiliate, to remind the one struck that they were not in a category of person worthy of a real punch. The open palm was reserved for equals. The back of the hand was for subordinates. Jesus does not say, if anyone slaps you on either cheek. He specifies the right cheek. That specificity is not an accident. The text is pointing at a concrete social practice, the ritualized gesture by which the powerful reminded the powerless of their position. And the instruction is not to duck, not to flee, not to cower. It is to turn, to present the left cheek, which sounds to a modern ear like an invitation to more abuse, the victim offering themselves for a second blow. And that is exactly how this verse has been preached in many traditions, as a command to absorb suffering without resistance. But there is a problem with that reading, and the problem is created by the text itself. Because the gesture Jesus is describing cannot be repeated, turning the left cheek is not offering the same target again. It is offering a different target with different meaning. And most readers never stop to ask what that change of target actually does. The verb Jesus uses for turn is strepho. It is not a word of passive endurance. It is a word of deliberate motion, a pivoting, a repositioning of the whole body. The person who turns is not standing there waiting to be hit again. They are changing the angle of the entire encounter. And here is where the physical mechanics become a theological argument. Once you turn the left cheek, the attacker who wants to strike you faces a problem. With a right hand, there is no way to backhand the left cheek. The only natural blow that lands on the left cheek from a right-handed person is the open palm or the fist. But the open palm was the blow between equals. A master would never strike a slave with an open palm. To do so would be to acknowledge that the slave was not a slave, not a thing, but a person, someone worthy of an equal's blow, someone who could even strike back. The backhand is a way of saying, I do not consider you an adversary, I consider you furniture. The open palm, by contrast, is a challenge between two people who are on level ground. So when the victim turns the left cheek, the aggressor must either stop entirely or escalate to a blow that treats the victim as an equal. That changes everything about the meaning of the verse. The turn is not submission. It is a move that forces equality. The victim has taken the one piece of power an aggressor owns, in that exchange the power to define the other person's status. By turning, the victim says, without a word, I will not accept the role you have assigned to me. You wanted a subordinate. You will have to decide whether to walk away or to look me in the eye and hit me as one person hits another. Either way, the dynamic is shattered. Now, that raises a question that the text does not answer immediately, and it is worth letting it sit unresolved for a moment. What if the aggressor chooses the fist? What if they escalate? Then the victim has traded a humiliating blow for a violent one, which does not sound like progress. The text, read quickly, seems to leave the victim worse off. But whether that is true depends on what Jesus actually thinks a person needs to be saved from in that moment. And that requires looking at the sentence that introduces the whole teaching you have heard, that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. The Greek word for resist here is antisthenai. It is a military term. It is the word a soldier would use for taking a defensive stance against an advancing enemy, bracing, holding the line, striking back to break the charge. Jesus is not telling his followers to be defenseless. He is telling them to stop defending themselves with the tools of the opponent. The eye for an eye principle was itself a limit on violence. It said the punishment must not exceed the crime. But Jesus is pointing at something deeper. The whole system of retaliation, even limited retaliation, keeps the victim locked in the same game as the aggressor. The victim is still reacting. The aggressor still gets to choose the weapon, the time, the place. and as long as the victim is reacting, the aggressor holds the position of the one who initiates. Jesus is offering a way out of the game, entirely a way that does not submit and does not escalate, but repositions the victim as the one who now sets the terms. So the question of what happens if the aggressor escalates to a fist cannot be answered by this verse alone. The next verse moves to a new scenario, a lawsuit about a tunic and a cloak. But the logic is continuous, and the connection between the two is the missing piece that most readings leave on the floor. Jesus is not giving his disciples a policy of non-resistance. He is giving them a manual for creative resistance that seizes the initiative in a conflict and forces the opponent to rethink what they are doing. That is what the turn does. It makes the aggressor feel, if only for a split second, the disorientation of having their domination suddenly not work. The backhand was supposed to silence. Instead, the victim is now staring at the aggressor with the left cheek exposed, and the aggressor has to decide with everyone watching whether they are going to treat this person as a slave or as a man. For the people who first heard Jesus say this, that would have been electric, because this was not a hypothetical scenario in a Roman courtroom. It was a daily reality. The streets of Galilee were full of Roman soldiers with the legal right to compel Jewish civilians to carry their packs for 1 mile. The law of impressment was a standing humiliation and enforced demonstration of who belonged to whom. A Jew who refused to carry the pack could be beaten with the flat of a spear. Jesus says, "Go with him 2 miles. Not as an act of cowardice, but as an act of autonomy. The soldier expects 1 mile, the law grants him 1 mile. By walking a 2nd mile voluntarily, the Jew has stepped outside the legal frame. The soldier is suddenly in an impossible position. He has no right to compel the 2nd mile, yet the Jew is walking anyway. Who is in control of that situation now? The one who was commanded has become the one who gives. The soldier must either acknowledge that he is being served by a free man or abandon the encounter. Either way, the dynamic of domination has been broken. Most of us will never be backhanded, and most of us will never be forced to carry a soldier's pack. But we know what it feels like to be struck with the back of a hand. It happens in offices, in families, in friendships every time someone speaks to you in a way that is designed to remind you that you are below them. A condescending correction disguised as help. A nickname you never accepted but are told to be grateful for. A public joke at your expense that would get a different reaction if you were an equal. The instinctive response is to absorb it, to tell yourself the person did not mean it, to preserve the peace. Or the instinct is to lash back, to find the sharper remark, to win the exchange. Those 2 options feel like the only 2 options, but the text is describing a third option that is neither passive nor violent, a response that refuses the identity, the insult assigned to you, while also refusing to descend to the level of the one who insulted you. The problem is that the third option requires a kind of presence and creativity that is not automatic. Anyone can flinch, anyone can retaliate, but to turn to redirect the encounter with the deliberate motion of strepho is a skill that has to be cultivated. It requires knowing in advance that you are not what the other person says you are. It requires being so settled in your own dignity that you do not need to prove it by counter-aggression. And it requires the nerve to take the initiative in a moment when every instinct tells you to either flee or fight. And this is where the teaching becomes nearly impossible to bear, because Jesus does not leave the backhand or the lawsuit or the occupation as past events. He is not writing a treatise on first-century resistance. He is describing, for every person who will ever hear this text, the shape of life in the kingdom of God, a life in which the victim refuses to remain a victim, and the aggressor is robbed of the comfort of an easy victory. But what does that actually look like when the aggressor refuses to change? That is the question the text leaves hanging. Because Jesus does not promise that turning the cheek will always produce a changed heart in the one who raised the hand. He promises something else. And to see what that something else is, you have to look at the strange verse that follows the one about the coat and the cloak, and recognize it not as a separate saying, but as the second half of the same move. The verse that follows is not a new topic. It is the same move, played on a different board. Jesus takes the scenario of a lawsuit, someone who wants to sue you and take your shirt, and says, "Hand over your coat as well." The The translators smooth this into something that sounds like pious surrender, but the original audience would have heard it as near scandal, because their law was very specific about garments. The inner shirt, the chitin, was the first layer of clothing against the skin, essentially underwear, the literal shirt off your back. The outer cloak, the himation, was more than clothing. It was a blanket at night, a coat in the cold, a pillow, a bag for carrying things, even a legal document in some cases. A man without his himation was not merely underdressed, he was destitute, exposed to the weather and to public shame. And that is why the law had an elaborate protective provision. In Exodus, God commands that if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge for a debt, you must return it by sunset, because that cloak is his only covering. What else will he sleep in? The law goes out of its way for the cloak, precisely because losing it was the difference between poverty and complete ruin. Now watch what Jesus does with that legal sensitivity. The scenario is a lawsuit with a creditor who seizes the shirt. That is already an act of aggression. The creditor is using the courts to strip a debtor of the clothes on his back. Jesus tells the debtor to hand over the himation as well. On the surface, that looks like the debtor giving up everything, surrendering to the demands of the powerful. But turn the scene around and look at it from the creditor's angle. If the debtor hands over his outer cloak voluntarily, the creditor is holding a garment that the law requires him to return before nightfall. He cannot keep it, and he has taken it in public. He has stood in court and stripped a man down to his undergarment, a sight that every witness would recognize as an outrage. The creditor does not look like a winner in that courtroom. He looks like a brute who has just exposed his own shameful greed. The debtor, on the other hand, has done something remarkable. He has given what he never owed, and by giving it he has turned the tables. The creditor wanted to take now. He is holding something he cannot keep. The debtor has made the injustice visible without lifting a finger. That is the same geometry as the turned cheek. In the first scenario, the aggressor's backhand was a gesture of domination. The turn forced him to choose between stopping and treating the victim as an equal. Here, the creditor's lawsuit is a weapon of domination. The voluntary giving of the cloak forces him into a position where the law and the watching community condemn him. The pattern is not passive submission. The pattern is the victim seizing the initiative and turning the aggressor's own power against him, not destructively, but with the quiet precision of someone who knows exactly what the aggressor is trying to do and refuses to cooperate with it. And notice something crucial in both cases. The victim does not escalate. He does not strike back. He does not file a counter lawsuit. He simply takes the situation the aggressor created and redefines it so thoroughly that the aggressor loses his footing. The Greek verb Jesus uses for handing over the cloak is aphes, from aphemi. That same word is the root of what he says later about forgiveness, the word for releasing a debt, letting a person go free, sending away what is owed. After the Lord's Prayer, he will explain forgiveness with the same term. The connection is not accidental. The action of giving the cloak to the creditor is not a surrender of your rights. It is a release of the debt, an aphemi, a deliberate act of letting go what the aggressor thinks he can take. And here is the shape of it when the victim refuses to hold onto what the aggressor wants. The aggressor's power over the victim snaps. The aggressor can only control you as long as you are defending something of yours. The moment you release it, he is left holding a thing he never earned, with no one to fight. That is the hidden theology of the whole passage. Forgiveness and resistance are not opposites. They are the same act, aimed at the same goal, breaking the cycle that keeps the world locked in domination and retaliation. For the first listeners, this would have landed with the force of a physical shock, because they lived under systems that depended on fear, and courts that existed to enforce the fear. A peasant in Galilee knew exactly what it meant to be sued by a creditor. The debtor was always wrong. The debtor was always stripped, and the law was the creditor's ally. When Jesus describes a debtor who volunteers his own cloak, he is describing a human being who is suddenly impossible to exploit because he has stopped treating his clothes as the thing that defines him. The creditor can take the cloak, but he cannot take the man's dignity because the man has already given the cloak away. The aggressor has all the legal power and none of the leverage. The man's life does not belong to his possessions anymore. It belongs to him alone. That is the question the text has been pressing since the turned cheek, and now it surfaces directly. What if the aggressor escalates? What if he takes the cloak and leaves the man naked in the cold? That is exactly the moment when the entire teaching looks like it fails. And the text, this strange, unflinching text, does not promise that it will not happen. Jesus does not say the creditor will soften. He does not say the soldier will refuse the second mile. He does not say the backhand will never land. What he gives instead is the deepest insight of the whole passage. The victim's safety was never the point. The point was that the victim would remain a person, not a thing, not a subordinate, not a household object that could be struck or sued or conscripted without consequence. Even if the aggressor takes everything, he cannot take the one thing that mattered: the victim's refusal to accept the role that was assigned to him. That is the something else Jesus promises. He does not promise that your dignity will protect you from harm. He promises that your dignity does not depend on what they take from you. Now, most of us will never face a Roman soldier with a spear, and most of us will never stand stripped before a court of creditors. But we have all been in situations where someone demands more than they have a right to ask, and we feel the pressure to comply because the system is stacked against us. A supervisor demands credit for your work, and the culture tells you to smile and absorb it. A family member crosses a boundary, and the unspoken rule says that speaking up will make things worse. A friend owes you money and never mentions it, and you tell yourself that pressing the issue would end the friendship. In every one of those moments, you feel the same two options that the peasant felt in that courtroom. You can absorb the wrong and stay silent, or you can fight back and be labeled the difficult one. Jesus is describing a third option that is not silence and not aggression. It is the decision to make the injustice visible, not by attacking the other person, but by acting so calmly and so deliberately that the other person has to look at what they are actually doing. That is what Ephemi makes possible. When you release the cloak, when you refuse to hold onto whatever it is they are trying to take from you, you are not saying that it did not matter. You are saying that you will not let the theft define you. You are placing yourself in a position where the other person is holding something they cannot use because the only value it had was the leverage it gave them over you, and you have taken that leverage away. A person who has forgiven a debt is not a doormat. A person who has forgiven a debt is the most dangerous person in the room because there is nothing left to hold against them. The reading that has been passed down about this passage, that Jesus commands his followers to be passive victims who absorb abuse and hope the abuser changes, is not in the text. It is a misreading that has made many faithful people swallow mistreatment in the name of obedience, and it has made many powerful people comfortable with the belief that their victims are obligated to submit. The backhand and the sued-for shirt are not instructions for how to lose gracefully. They are demonstrations of how to win without becoming what you oppose. When a person turns the cheek, they are not saying, "Strike me again." They are saying, "I am not the person you thought I was." When a person hands over the cloak, they are not saying, "Take more." They are saying, "Whatever you take from me, you will not take my dignity, and everyone will know what you have done." That is not weakness. It is a whole body of courage, trained to respond with something other than the inherited scripts. The cost of that courage is real. Turning the cheek does not guarantee that the hand will drop. Giving the cloak does not guarantee that the creditor will be shamed into repentance. What it guarantees is that the person who reacts this way will not become a collaborator in his own dehumanization. The world has two ways of making a person into a victim. The first is violence, and the second is convincing the person that violence is the only response. When you answer a backhand with a backhand, you stay inside the world. The aggressor built a world where power is measured in blows landed and faces saved. When you answer with the turned cheek, you have stepped outside that world entirely. You have stopped fighting on the aggressor's terms, which means the aggressor has lost the thing he needed most from you, your participation in his game. So what is the promise beneath the whole passage? It is not that the aggressor will be converted by your good behavior. It is not that the suffering will be avoided by your cleverness. It is that you will not be consumed by it. The person who turns and gives emerges from the encounter with something the aggressor will never have: the serene knowledge that they were not a victim, even when they were struck, even when they were stripped. And that is the freedom the kingdom of God runs on, not a promise that no one will ever hurt you, but the certainty that the hurting cannot reach the part of you that is already safe. The hand that strikes the cheek cannot strike the soul. The creditor who takes the cloak cannot take the man. And when that truth is finally settled in a person, they are freed from the terror that makes retaliation feel necessary, freed from the panic that makes submission feel inescapable. That is the kingdom Jesus describes in these verses, not a kingdom of passive sufferers, but a kingdom of people who have learned to be untouchable, not because they are armored against pain, but because their identity is anchored somewhere no one can reach. The backhand was meant to tell the victim who he was. The turn tells the backhand who he is not. And the one who has learned to turn like this has already won the only battle that ever mattered, the battle over what to believe about yourself when someone is trying to prove you are nothing.